Hi, I'm Jim. Today we're going to be talking about the physical scale of Star Citizen and whether or not it's just too large. Now, for those of you who might be new here, Star Citizen is an ambitious space simulation game that aims to create a unique universe for players to explore. With over 100 systems planned, each filled with planets, moons, space stations, and more, the scale of the game is truly massive. But with such an expansive universe, it's often left me wondering if it's just too big. But before we break that down, I would like to just quickly mention that I have started a Discord server for my community to join. If that's something that interests you, look for the link to that down in the description. Now let's use the only current system we have full access to start off this discussion, Stanton, which already feels quite large, and it's by no means the largest system planned for in-game. Traveling from one planet to another can take quite a bit of time, especially if you're flying with a fuel-efficient quantum drive. Let's take a look using a stock loadout on a 600i as our example. Now, it comes by default with an Odyssey drive, and flying from Microtech to Arcorp would take a little over 8 minutes of travel time with this drive, and that's a distance of 59 gigameters. If we swap out that stock drive for the XL1, we basically cut that time in half with a 4.5 minute travel duration. That's not bad at all, except when we pull away from being zoomed in on Stanton and start thinking about travel time not just within a singular system, but across multiple ones, these minutes really start to add up, especially when looking at the fact that there are 100 systems in total planned. Now, we've already kind of started to have our expectations for the number of systems in game for the initial 1.0 launch kind of tempered to around 5 or so systems in total, with those systems likely being Terra, Stanton, Pyro, Castra, and Nyx. Now, with just a singular system, we really aren't too worried about the quantum drives for the most part. We just pick the fastest one that'll let us clear long jumps. But I have a feeling that when 1.0 comes around, or possibly even sooner for when Pyro comes out, our priorities are going to shift a little. Looking at the two previous drives we discussed earlier, the Odyssey and the XL1, we can see that the XL1 is a bit more than twice as fast as the Odyssey. However, it also consumes more than double the fuel to travel 1 gigameter, 23.98 quantum fuel per gigameter versus 10.9 quantum fuel per gigameter, respectively. This gives us a total travel distance with the Odyssey of around 275.23 gigameters before running out of quantum fuel, and only about 125.1 gigameters of total travel with the XL1. Now, traveling twice the speed is great, but having to stop and refuel with each system is going to negate most of the speed advantage, not to mention adding to the total cost of operating the ship to begin with. Also, a quick note on the map we're looking at. I always thought this map was dev created, but it's not. It was actually a community submitted map. So quick shout out to Selby for taking the time to make this for the community to use. But let's look at what will likely be a commonly traveled route between Sol and Terra. Now, I do want to mention that I won't be surprised if they rework some of these connections we see on this map. If you aren't aware, they have recently decided that the static jump points between systems will no longer be size restricted. They will be allowing all ships of all sizes to transit through all jump points. Again, that's the static jump points, not the transient or dynamic ones. So connections like these, where we have a bridge from Magnus to Terra going around Stanton, I wouldn't be surprised to see some connections like this removed. But I'd also imagine we'll probably gain a few connections as well because of this change. But for now, we'll just have to use the information we have available at current. Now, I set out to do some math and rediscovered something that I had already read about but had completely forgotten, just because, well, it's not something that we really think about, or at least I don't think about often while playing Star Citizen. So even though Stanton is listed at being 4.85 AU in size, its actual in-game size is far smaller than that. The system is dimensionally about a 10th scale, so 4.85 AU converted to gigameter is 725, and thank goodness we aren't having to travel those distances across Stanton, at least not with the current quantum speeds. So at 10th scale, Stanton is about half an AU in size. Now, knowing that, let's use the ARC star map to have it calculate a few routes for us. So getting back to the Sol-Terra route we were looking at, the shortest route is about 20.09 AU, or once we shrink that to scale, 2.009 AU or 300 gigameters. That's going to be about 40 minutes with the Odyssey drive. Now with the current specs, you should actually use the Aether drive instead of the Odyssey drive, as you'll be able to make the trip entirely without having to refuel, and you should only add about 1 minute of additional flight time with the current in-game specs. The XL1 can make this trip in just over 19 minutes. However, you're going to have to stop to refill at least twice, possibly 3 times, depending on the spacing between jump gates. Now, none of these times included any estimates for refuels or even gate transit times, which we've been told will be around 3 minutes at current. So with the 6 jumps in this example, you're going to have to tack on another 18 minutes to these times, bringing your one-way Seoul to Terra trip to right at an hour. This example also assumed that you're sitting at the outgate in Seoul and ends as soon as you arrive into Terra. You're going to have to add more time for leaving the actual starting point in Seoul and getting to that gate, and then more time again for reaching your actual destination within Terra. You're going to be well over an hour. And this only gets worse once you look at going from, say, an extreme to the next. If you want to take a safe route from Elysium to Horus, you're looking at 89.14 AU. It's almost 4.5 times longer than our first example, so over a 3-hour travel duration with gate transit times included, but no time estimate for refueling. Now, the problem with most space games that I've encountered is that most systems and games just have no reason to be there. It's all just fluff or filler used for marketing hype. Look at Elite Dangerous, which is 1-to-1 of the Milky Way. It's just too much filler. Too many systems feel like the previous 15 that you were just in. And Elite's not alone in that. As I've mentioned many times before, I spent a significant amount of time, years, playing EVE Online. And while there are significantly fewer systems in EVE than Elite, they still have the same problem, with around 7,800 systems in total if you include all types of space. And most of them feel and honestly are pretty empty. You can go multiple jumps without seeing a single person in any system, or at least you could when I played. And I've been arguing since Starfield came out that Bethesda would have been so much better off to make a game that revolved around just the Soul system. Space is already big. You don't need 800 systems to make a space game feel large. They could have easily fit the majority of the narrative of Starfield into one system and given much greater depth of detail on each location instead of what we ended up with, which ended up feeling honestly sparse and mostly generic. And that's kind of what I'm getting at with StarCitizen as well. So far, based on what we have in Stanton, it feels honestly pretty good. The system feels lived in, or at least far more so than it used to. Not a system completely devoid of life. And I'd imagine that once Quantum or StarSim or whatever they're calling it now, as soon as those start to come kind of online, I think we could really start feeling like the game has an actual population to interact with. And they're going to have to be careful with balance, not just throwing in empty systems for the sake of claiming we have 20 systems. While sure, it sounds great for Elite and EVE and Starfield that they have so many systems to explore, like we've discussed, most of them are useless. We don't need 100 systems if 80 of them end up being just a time sink to fly through. Each system should have the potential to offer something to a player. Now, not every system will appeal to every player, and I'm fine with that. Ultimately, I will likely be living in a system that allows for more PvP than what some other players might find tolerable, and vice versa. They might want to make their primary system one that doesn't personally appeal to me. That's completely fine. That's balanced. So long as the systems have appeal to some portion of the player base, and so long as they have a reason for being there and enriching the universe and not just ticking off a metric of we have X number of planets and X number of moons and X number of systems. It's going to be a real challenge for CIG to balance travel time though. You don't want people to be able to be anywhere they want within 20 minutes either. As the developers in EVE found out, the need to separate players from one another is actually pretty great at times. And not just for server stability, but you don't want every combat engagement turning into a blob fest where the N+1 team is always the winner. EVE actually had to impose a pretty serious nerf to a portion of ships that had the ability to jump across multiple systems at once. The devs decided they had to restrict the amount of force projection that large orgs had at their disposal. Now, I think CIG has a few ways they could reduce the suck of system travel times without touching the overall quantum drive speeds. Because like I said, Stanton feels pretty balanced at the moment with regards to travel time. Again, you want the ability to have small conflicts start and end before every other player in the game can respond to what's happening. One thing they could easily do is just change the location of the jump gates. If you take a moment and just click through the Arc Star map, most of the gates tend to be at the edge of the system. And conceptually, that makes sense. Jump gates have always been at the edge of the system and line up with wherever they're connected to. However, there's nothing stopping CIG from having them be much closer in proximity to one another. You could easily have them be far closer to one another and significantly reduce the amount of time to travel between multiple systems, while still keeping a balance for travel time inside those systems. It would even make failing a jump point transit more punishing. If you drop out of the perimeter of the system instead of the intended exit point, where I would have spent significantly less time traveling to my next jump point, well, now since I failed and I'm on the edge of the system, I have to travel much further to get to my next transit point. The size of Star Systems and StarCitizen are both a strength and a challenge. It can create a truly immersive and expansive universe, but it also presents difficulties in maintaining consistent player engagement and interactions. And with trying to balance between oppressive travel times and while also having enough time to delay to split up the player base from one another. But what do you think? Are the systems in StarCitizen just too large? Do you enjoy the vastness of the space they're trying to build? And don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more content like this. But until next time, see you in the verse.